ancient army of warriors has been quietly conquering the world. Wherever small battalions of China's famous terracotta warriors are exhibited, they win over a new legion of fans.
Beneath a low hill outside the city of Xi'an in the dry heart of central China, an army has been standing at attention for more than 2,000 years. 8,000 soldiers, not carved from marble, not cast in bronze, but shaped from ordinary clay. And each one wears a face, a real face, a jaw, a brow, the curve of an ear, the faint downturn of a mouth. Row after row of them frozen in the dark, waiting for an order that never came. And in 2025, when researchers finally turned artificial intelligence loose on those faces, when they let a machine measure every ear, every chin, every asymmetry with no idea what it was looking for, the machine reported something back that no one was prepared to hear. Something that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about who these soldiers really were. Sit with that for a moment, because to understand why it shook the people who study the ancient world, you first have to understand the man who built this army and what he believed he could become. His name before the world knew him by another was Yong, and he did not want to die. Not slow, not fast, not in 100 years, not ever. He believed genuinely, completely, that a man of sufficient power could refuse death the way a king refuses a lesser king, that he could become something more than mortal, something closer to a god. And when the elixirs failed him, as they always would, he built an insurance policy on a scale the human race had never attempted. He built a second empire underground, a city of the dead, complete with soldiers, weapons, horses, chariots, rivers, even a sky, all of it waiting to serve him in whatever came after the last breath. The clay army you have seen in photographs is not the tomb. It is only the outermost guard, the gate, the seal that keeps the living out and perhaps in his mind keeps something else in. But nobody knew any of that on a spring day in 1974, when the story truly begins. Not with an emperor, but with thirst. There had been a drought. The fields outside a small village near Shirayan had gone hard and pale, and the well the farmers depended on had shrunk to mud. So a group of them chose a new spot in a pimin orchard and began to dig, hoping to reach water. They went down through the loose yellow lust that covers that whole region, the fine wind-blown soil that has settled over the land for tens of thousands of years. 3 feet, 6 feet, 9. The digging was slow, and the sun was merciless, and the water did not come. And then somewhere around 15 foot down, a shovel struck something that was not earth and was not stone. It was solid, and it was fired, and it rang wrong. They cleared the dirt away by hand, expecting a pot or an old kiln or a buried piece of a broken roof. What came loose from the wall of the pit instead was a human head, life-sized clay, staring up out of the ground with open, patient eyes. One of the men later said it looked like a temple. God had been buried alive, and for a moment they simply stood around the hole, not saying anything at all. Then they kept digging, because that is what frightened practical people do. They keep working, and the ground kept giving a torso. Then broken pieces of armor rendered in clay, overlapping plates as delicate as fish scales, then arms, then glinting in the loose soil, small triangular points of green-crusted bronze, arrowheads, real ones 2,000 years old and still sharp enough to draw blood. They did not understand what they had found. Why would they? They gathered the pieces and stacked them at the edge of the field, and some of the bronze arrowheads were quietly sold off for a few coins, pocket money, the price of a meal. The clay bodies, broken and headless, were treated as an inconvenience in the way of the water they still had not reached. For a little while, one of the largest archaeological discoveries in human history sat in a pile beside a dry well, waiting for somebody to realize what it was. That somebody was a local official named Zhao Kang, a man who worked with cultural relics for the county and who had spent his life around the odds and ends the earth in that region tended to cough up. Rumors reached him that farmers had dug up strange clay men, that pieces were being sold. He got in a vehicle and drove out to the village, and the moment he saw the fragments laid out in the dust, something in him went cold and certain. These were not the crude grave figures that turned up now and then in old fields. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The scale was human. The armor was accurate. Whatever these were, they were not ordinary, and they were not few. He gathered up what he could, loaded the broken warriors into the back of the vehicle, and began piece by piece to put a man back together, literally reassembling the first of the terracotta soldiers with his own hands. He was right to be afraid of how big it might be. He had no idea how right, because when the archaeologists came and the careful excavation began, the orchard peeled back to reveal not a handful of buried statues, but rows ranks corridors of clay soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect military formation, disciplined, silent, and every single one of them facing the same direction, east toward the lands of the rival kingdoms kingdoms this emperor had conquered and crushed to build his empire. 2,000 years dead, and still the army stood guard against the old enemies, still watching the horizon they had been ordered to watch. And that was only the beginning of what lay under that quiet hill. What the trenches revealed over the following seasons redrew the scale of the thing entirely. This was not a monument, it was a garrison. When the archaeologists mapped the full extent of what lay beneath the fields, the numbers stopped sounding like archaeology and started sounding like a census. More than 8,000 warriors, over 100 wooden chariots, their frames long rotted, but their shapes still ghosted in the soil. Hundreds of horses cast in clay with flared nostrils and braided manes, harnessed as if waiting for the command to move. All of it buried in a series of vast underground chambers, roofed with timber and matting and packed earth, sealed away from the sky for over 22 centuries. And here is the detail that should make you sit with what these people were attempting. What has been excavated, all of it, every soldier you have ever seen photographed, every rank standing in those enormous covered halls outside Shirayan, that is only a fraction. Most of the army is still down there, still underground, still undug, untouched, uncounted, exactly where the workers left it before the last cartload of earth went over the top. We are even now looking at a corner of the thing. The full formation remains sealed in the dark, and no one alive has seen all of it. Consider the first chamber alone, the one they call Pit 1, and try to hold its size in your mind. It runs roughly 755 feet long and 200 feet wide. The footprint of 2 football fields laid end to end, hollowed out and filled with an army. And it is not arranged for display. It is arranged for war. At the front, 3 rows of soldiers stand as a vanguard, unarmored, ready to absorb the first shock of contact. Behind them, the main body, column after column of armored infantry, packed into corridors, divided by walls of rammed earth, flanked by outer files turned to guard the sides. This is not decoration. This is a real army's real order of battle, frozen at the instant before the charge. An entire tactical doctrine from the 3rd century before Christ, preserved in clay so we could read it 2,000 years later. Walk into the second chamber and the doctrine changes. Pit 2 is what military historians call a combined arms formation, the sophisticated interlocking of different fighting units into a single machine. Here are the cavalry, each horse held by a standing soldier at its head. Here are the war chariots, 4H horse teams with their crews aboard. And here, most hauntingly, are the kneeling archers down on one knee, torsos twisted, arms drawn back, caught forever in the exact posture of loosing an arrow that will never fly. You can see the tension in the shoulders. You can see the concentration the sculptor pressed into the brow. Beside them, the standing archers wait in reserve. It is a functioning battle plan cast in earth. The 3rd chamber is the smallest, and it may be the most important of them all. Pit 3 holds only 68 figures, but they are not soldiers in the ordinary sense. They stand facing one another, lining a corridor arranged around a single elaborate 4-horse chariot. There are officers here. This is the command post, the headquarters from which the whole ghostly army would, in the emperor's imagination, be directed. The mind of the formation. And then there is the 4th pit. And the 4th pit tells its own quiet story because the 4th pit is empty, dug out, prepared, and never filled. An unfinished chamber abandoned mid-construction. A gap in the ranks that hints at something that went wrong. Project interrupted. A deadline that death or rebellion never let the builders meet. Now stand back from the numbers and ask the simple question. Who makes this? Who commits 4 decades and hundreds of thousands of hands to burying an army no living I was ever meant to see? To answer that, you have to look at how the soldiers themselves were made, because the method is as astonishing as the scale, and it tells you exactly what kind of state built them. Each warrior stands between 5 and 12 and 6 feet tall, full human height, some of them taller than the men who dug them up. Each weighs several hundred lb, and yet they are hollow, built strong through structure rather than sheer mass. Engineered the way you would engineer a load-bearing thing meant to last. The bodies were assembled in parts. Legs, often solid for stability, formed the base. The torso was built up on top, hollow, coil by coil. The arms were made separately. The head was made separately. And then, while the clay was still soft and wet and willing, the pieces were joined. The seams worked smooth, the whole figure brought together into one standing man before it ever went near a kiln. The clay itself was not simply scooped from the riverbank. It was a recipe, a prepared and controlled blend. The base was the local lows, the fine, pale, wind-laid soil of that region, which the people there had understood and worked for generations. Into it went quartz, ground in to give the fired body strength and resistance to cracking, and kaolin, the pale fine clay that potters prize, added for smoothness and for a certain flexibility in the working, so the sculptors could press in the fine detail without the surface tearing. This is not folk craft. This is a specification. This is a material engineered to a standard and reproduced thousands of times. Because that is what this operation truly was. Industrial, state-managed, systematized, running at a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. Molds were used to turn out the standardized parts at volume. A set number of head shapes shapes, torso types, hand positions, cast again and again like components on a production line more than 2,000 years before the phrase would exist. Rank after rank of interchangeable pieces, ready to be assembled into soldiers. And if the story ended there, it would already be one of the great feats of the ancient world. But it does not end there because of what the makers did next. Once those molded parts came out, and that is where the strangeness truly begins. Take a molded head fresh from its two-piece mold. At that moment, it is generic, a blank, a type, one of a handful of standard shapes stamped out by the Hun. If the state had only wanted an army that looked like an army from a distance, it could have stopped there. Fire the blanks, line them up, seal the pit. No one alive was ever going to walk those corridors and inspect a jaw. And yet, this is the exact moment the makers refused to stop. Because after the molded pieces came out, the sculptors went back to each one by hand and they reworked it into an individual. Think about what that means at this scale. Not a few showpieces near the front. Thousands of faces, each one taken back to the workbench and altered until it became somebody specific. To this day, after all the excavation and all the counting, no two warriors have been found that are truly identical. Stand in the pit and let your eye travel down a single row, and you will see it happen in real time. One man has a broad, heavy jaw and thick cheeks. The next is lean, hollow shape, older looking around the eyes. Cheekbones sit high on one face and low on another. The ears, and hold on to the ears because the ears will matter enormously in a moment, are all different. Some flat against the skull, some flared, some with long lobes, some short. The hairlines differ. The top knots and braids are tied in patterns that vary from figure to figure, as if catching the small vanities of real men. The mustaches curl or droop or bristle. And the noses. Look closely at the noses and you will find that some run straight and true and others bend crooked as though broken once and healed slightly off. Some of the mouths are set hard and grim. Others hold the faintest suggestion of ease, almost of amusement, the way a face relaxes when its owner has stopped bothering to perform. These are not the standardized expressions of a decoration. These are moods. And then there is the detail that has kept scholars arguing for the better part of half a century. On the faces of some of these warriors, cut into the clay of the lips and the cheeks, are fine raised lines. Lines that look unmistakably like the ridges of healed scars. Not decoration, not tool marks. The specific particular kind of blemish that a living face carries because that living face went through something. A blade, a fall, a hard life lived before it was fixed forever in fired earth. Sit with what that implies. If these faces were invented, pulled from the sculptor's imagination to fill a quota, why would anyone invent a scar? A scar is the opposite of an ideal. It is a flaw, a piece of biography, the mark of an accident that a designer building a perfect eternal legion would have every reason to leave out. And yet, there they are, healed and specific, pressed into the clay by someone who apparently wanted that particular imperfection preserved. For decades, the question has hung over the pits like the dust that never quite settles. Were these faces built from imagination, or were they built from men? Real men standing in real light while a sculptor studied the particular slope of a particular nose and the particular set of a particular mouth and copied it down into the wet clay so that it would outlast its owner by 2,000 years. The debate never resolved because the human eye can only take you so far. One person looks down a row and sees infinite variety and calls it portraiture. Another looks and sees the natural drift you would expect when thousands of tired craftsmen work by hand. Small inconsistencies, not deliberate likenesses. Both can point at the same face and see something different because the eye argues and the eye can be talked out of things. What was needed was something that could not be talked out of anything. Something that did not care what the answer was supposed to be. Something with no theory to defend, no career riding on the outcome, no romantic wish for the faces to be real, and no scholarly caution wishing them ordinary. That is where, in 2025, the machine entered the pit. Researchers took the question that human beings had circled for 50 years and handed it to an artificial intelligence. But not to guess and not to imagine. They fed it measurement. High-resolution three-dimensional scanning was used to capture the faces of the warriors at a fineness far beyond what any eye could register, turning each clay face into a cloud of millions of points, a map of every curve and hollow and ridge down to the fraction of a millimeter. And then machine learning was set loose across that data, comparing thousands upon thousands of microscopic measurements between one face and the next. The angle of the ear where it meets the skull, the depth of the chin, the precise asymmetry between the left side of a face and the right, the distance between features that no sculptor would consciously measure and no observer would consciously notice. They did not tell it what they hoped to find. They did not instruct it to prove the face faces were real or to prove they were fantasy. They simply gave it everything and asked it to report the patterns in the numbers to tell them what the geometry itself said, free of the wishes of the humans who had argued for 2 generations. And this is the crucial thing about handing the question to a machine like this. It does not know the legend. It does not feel the weight of the emperor's ambition or the romance of a buried army. It has no stake in immortality. It sees only distances and angles and ratios, and it says only what those distances and angles and ratios say. What it said when the analysis came back is the reason this story is being told at all, because the first thing the machine noticed was in the ears, and what the ears revealed was not something a factory could ever have produced. Ears, it turns out, are one of the strangest and most personal things a human body carries. No 2 people on Earth share the same ear. The fold of the helix, the depth of the bowl, the way the lobe attaches or hangs free, the tiny ridge that runs down toward the opening, these vary from person to person in ways so reliable that some identification systems treat an ear almost like a fingerprint. An ear is not a feature you design. It is a feature you inherit, shaped by a specific combination of genes carried by a specific human being who lived and breathed and turned his head when someone called his name. And when the machine looked across the ears of the terracotta warriors, it did not find the shallow, repeated variety of decoration. It found the deep structural variety of biology. The ear shapes carried a kind of anatomical specificity that appears only in real human populations. Not the neat difference of a craftsman deciding to make this ear a little longer and that one a little rounder, but the messy, irregular, repeatable difference you see when you scan a crowd of actual living men. The proportions between the parts of the ear behave the way they behave in real anatomy. Constrained in the ways real ears are constrained. Varied in the ways real ears vary. Sit with that for a moment. The most overlooked part of the face. The part no visitor lingers on. The part a sculptor working fast would treat as an afterthought. That was the part carrying the signature of something real. But the ears were only the beginning, because the machine did not stop at cataloging shapes. It measured asymmetry, and asymmetry is where the story deepened into something that genuinely unsettled the people running the analysis. Every human face is lopsided, not dramatically, but measurably. The left eye sits a fraction higher than the right, or the jaw is heavier on one side, or one cheekbone rides forward of its twin. This is the fingerprint of a living organism, the record of a body that grew unevenly, that favored one side while chewing, that carried the accidents of decades in the flesh of the face. A perfectly symmetrical face is not a human face. It is an idea of a face. And when a sculptor invents a face from imagination, the asymmetry he produces tends to be random and shallow, the small errors of a hand that meant to be even and wasn't quite. The asymmetry the machine found in the warriors was not that kind. It matched the asymmetry pattern of real individuals. The way the left and right sides of a given warrior's face disagreed with each other followed the specific coherent logic of a single person's growth. As though each face had been asymmetrical, the way one particular man was asymmetrical, not the way a tired craftsman's hand happens to slip. The lopsidedness was internally consistent face by face in the manner of biology rather than the manner of error. And no 2 faces were lopsided in the same way. Each carried its own private disagreement between left and right the way each of us does. The machine had no word for what this meant. It does not do meaning. It reported geometry. But the researchers reading the report understood exactly what the geometry was pointing at. And the working theory that emerged from it is the one that 50 years of human debate had never been able to settle. At least some of these warriors, and the evidence pointed most strongly toward the higher-ranking figures, the officers, the ones with rank and standing, appear to have been modeled on real people, real men with real ears and real crooked faces who stood in front of an artist 22 centuries ago and had their likenesses pressed into clay. Think about what that would mean for those men. To be an officer in the emperor's service and to be told that your face, your actual face, your ears, your uneven jaw, the specific way your features refused to match themselves, was being copied into a soldier that would never rot, never age, never die. A soldier that would stand in the dark, holding its formation long after your bones had turned to dust. The living warriors would grow old and fall in battle and be buried and forgotten, but their clay doubles would keep the watch. That is not decoration. That is conscription into eternity. The emperor was not only building an army to guard him in death. He may have been binding specific named breathing human beings to serve him forever, pinning their identities into the earth so that the men themselves could never fully leave his service, even after the men themselves were gone. And here, the machine's finding folds back into the strange lips. The earlier observers had noticed the fine lines on some mouths that look like healed scars, the noses that bend as though they had once been broken. Because if these faces were portraits, then those were not artistic flourishes. Those were biography. That crooked nose was a nose that had actually been broken. That scar line was a scar. The clay was not inventing wounds. It was recording them, keeping the injuries of forgotten men on permanent display. A ledger of old fights written into the faces of soldiers soldiers who would never fight again. The archaeological world had spent decades asking whether the faces were real. The numbers, refusing to care what anyone wanted the answer to be, had come back and said, real enough to carry a man's broken nose. But the faces the machine studied were not the faces the ground first surrendered. Because when these warriors came up out of the earth, they did not come up gray. They came up in color. And the color did something that no one was prepared for. Understand what the first excavators actually saw in those early moments before the air did its work. The soldiers were not the pale, dignified stone gray we picture. They were painted skin tones warmed with pink robes and reds pulled from cinnabar. Deep and blood-bright trousers and sleeves and blues and greens and a striking impossible purple. Eyes detailed, cheeks flushed as though the men were alive and had simply been standing very still for a very long time. For a few seconds, the diggers were not looking at monuments. They were looking at a crowd. And then the crowd began to die again because the pigment did not sit directly on the clay. It sat on a thin layer of lacquer. A lacquer that had spent 2,000 years sealed in cool, still humid darkness. The instant that darkness was broken, the instant dry air touched it, the lacquer began to lose its water. It curled, it cracked, it lifted away from the surface in tiny flakes, and it took the color with it. Not over weeks, not over hours. In some cases, the paint peeled and fell within seconds of exposure, faster than anyone could photograph it, faster than a hand could move to stop it. The excavators watched the colors of the ancient army flee back into nothing, as if the men themselves were dissolving before their eyes. Most of what those warriors originally wore is simply gone, burned off by our own atmosphere the moment we found them. And one of those colors was a color that should have made the archaeological world stop cold on its own. Among the pigments was a brilliant luminous purple, a shade so distinctive that specialists gave it a name, Han purple, a Chinese purple. And here is the part that unsettles the chemists more than the painters. That purple was not ground from any mineral you can dig out of a hillside. It was manufactured. It is a synthetic beryllium copper silicate, a compound built through a controlled high-temperature chemical process, one of the earliest man-made pigments known anywhere on Earth. To produce it, you have to hit a narrow temperature window and hold it. And you have to understand, at least by practice, a piece of chemistry that the modern world would not formally rediscover for millennia. 22 centuries ago, in the workshops feeding this tomb, someone had learned to make a color that did not exist in nature and then used it to paint an army for a dead king. Sit with that. An operation that could portrait a man's broken nose in clay was the same operation that could synthesize a pigment ahead of its time, arm 40,000 bronze weapons with matched interchangeable parts, and rig the whole thing into rivers of poison. This was not superstition scratching at the dark. This was a state, a machine of a state, pointing its full industrial capacity at a single obsession, keeping one man in power after death. And the man at the center of it never stopped being afraid. King Zhang had taken the throne of Qin as a boy of about 13 and then done what no one before him had managed. Swallowed every rival kingdom one after another until in 221 BC the wars simply stopped because there was no one left to fight. He named himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He forced one currency, one system of weights, one width of road, one law enforced without mercy. His state's name, Qin, is the seed of the word the West still uses for the whole country. He built a blueprint that outlived his own dynasty by 2,000 years. And with all of that in his hands, the one enemy he could not conquer was the one every human being loses to. So he chased it. He sent an alchemist out across the sea with fleets and thousands of people to find the elixir of life. And the alchemist sailed away and never came back. He drank the medicines his court prepared for him. Tonics meant to make him immortal. Tonics that historians now believe were laced with mercury. The same substance flooding his tomb in artificial rivers may have been trickling dose by dose into the emperor himself. He collapsed in 210 BC around 49 years old, killed in part by the very cure he trusted to save him. And the empire he had welded together with such violence came apart almost the instant his heart stopped. Succession orders forged, heirs destroyed, the whole structure gone within a handful of years. He built something to last forever. It lasted barely 15, except the army. The army is still standing, and the tomb at the center of it, the 249-foot mound, the underground fortress with its walls and its rigged crossbows and its poisoned rivers and its ceiling of stars has never been opened. Not because no one wants to, because no one dares. Conservators will tell you plainly, there is no technology that can stabilize a sealed space that large in the moment air first reaches it. We watch the colors die in seconds. Imagine an entire buried palace doing the same. The support beams may be rotted. The groundwater from the nearby mountain sits close. One wrong cut and it collapses or floods before anyone can react. So the seal holds. The emperor who feared death more than anything still decides who is permitted to enter his tomb. And so far, 22 centuries later, the answer is no one. An AI looked into the faces of his soldiers and found real men bound to his service forever. But the man himself remains locked in the dark. Guarded by ghosts, we made his prisoners.